Hello everyone, and welcome back to Terriffying Tales. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. Working the night shift at an old, out-of-the-way diner in a small town wasn't something I ever thought would lead to anything unusual. The diner itself had been in business for decades, run by an elderly couple who seemed to know more about the place than they let on. I took the night shifts mainly to keep myself busy while I worked on my writing, but there was something unsettling about the place. The walls, covered in faded wallpaper, seemed to press in on you, and the flickering neon sign outside cast long shadows inside the diner. One night, just after the dinner rush had passed and the diner was mostly empty, I noticed something strange. I was wiping down the counter when I felt a cold draft sweep through the room, even though the door was closed. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just the air conditioning or a draft from the old windows. But then, I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the corner booth, the one that was never really used by customers. I glanced over, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw someone sitting there, their back facing me. The tapping continued in a steady rhythm, almost like they were trying to get my attention. I blinked and the figure vanished, leaving only the empty booth. My heart began to race, and I quickly tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light or my imagination. But that booth had always given me the creeps, and something about that night made it feel different. The days following that incident were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the diner anymore. I started noticing small things: utensils moved out of place, glasses had condensation on them when no one had ordered a drink, and the temperature fluctuated unnaturally. Every night I'd close the diner, the atmosphere would feel heavier, as if something was waiting for me to leave. I'd often hear the faint sound of footsteps when I was locking the back door, but when I turned around, no one would be there. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't the only one who felt uneasy. One of the waitresses, a young girl named Kate, confided in me one evening that she'd seen strange things while working late shifts too. She'd been working the late shift for a while and had noticed similar occurrences: flickering lights, cold spots, and objects that seemed to move on their own. The thing that unsettled her the most, though, was the smell. Every once in a while, she'd get a whiff of something foul, like rotten food or something decaying, even though the diner was always kept spotless. Kate told me that she had heard rumors about the diner's past, rumors that the owners never spoke of. The diner had been built in the 1950s, and in the early years, there had been a tragic accident in the kitchen. The previous owner, who had been in charge before the elderly couple, had died in a fire that started in the back storage room. Some said he'd been trapped inside and had perished in the flames, while others claimed that he had deliberately started the fire, driven by some unknown madness. Either way, the fire left a permanent scar on the building, and the people who worked there afterwards swore the place was haunted. One night, I stayed late to finish some paperwork, hoping to get it done before the next shift began. The diner was eerily quiet, the hum of the refrigerators and the clinking of my pen on the paper the only sounds in the empty room. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of something crashing in the kitchen. I stood up and went to check, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the kitchen, everything was exactly as it had been before: clean, organized, and undisturbed. A sense of dread settled in my stomach as I realized that whatever had caused the sound had to be something else. The longer I worked there, the more I started to feel like I was being watched. The mirrors on the walls, once bright and clear, now seemed clouded, as if something was lingering just out of sight. I began to feel a constant pressure in the back of my mind, a nagging sensation that something was going to happen, that I was being drawn into something far darker than I could comprehend. The worst night came a week later. I was closing up alone when the lights in the diner flickered and went out completely. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that made you aware of every breath you took. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the darkness as I tried to find the circuit breaker. Then I heard the soft tapping sound, but this time it wasn't coming from the booth. It was coming from behind me. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat as I saw a shadow move along the far end of the diner. It was tall, too tall to be a trick of the light, and it moved with an unnatural slowness. My legs felt frozen in place as I watched it drift toward the kitchen before vanishing entirely. I didn't wait to find out more. I grabbed my bag and ran out the front door, locking it behind me with shaking hands. After that night, I never went back. I quit my job the next morning over the phone, making up an excuse about moving out of town. The owners didn't ask questions, and I got the feeling they had heard similar excuses before. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined everything, if maybe the exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere had gotten to me. But deep down, I know what I saw, and I know that something unnatural lingers in that diner. Months later, I drove past the place on a whim, just to see if it was still there. The neon sign flickered as it always had, casting those familiar long shadows inside. For a moment I thought I saw something move in the corner booth, but I didn't stop to look closer. I kept driving, the memory of that last night still fresh in my mind. Whatever is waiting in that diner, I hope it never follows me. Story 2. I had always been skeptical about haunted places until I spent a weekend at an old bed and breakfast in rural Pennsylvania. The building had been standing for over 100 years, and its history was full of strange occurrences. The owners mentioned guests leaving in the middle of the night, but I dismissed it as exaggeration. The idea of an abandoned inn with a dark past intrigued me more than it scared me. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the musty air and the way my footsteps echoed through the wooden halls. The receptionist, an older woman with tired eyes, handed me a heavy brass key. She told me my room was on the second floor at the end of the hall, the farthest from the staircase. I found it odd that she made a point to mention that, but I didn't ask any questions. The room itself was small, with antique furniture and faded floral wallpaper peeling at the edges. The only window overlooked the backyard, where an old wooden bench sat beneath a gnarled tree. I set my bag down and tested the bed, which creaked under my weight. As I sat there, I became aware of how unnaturally quiet the entire inn was. That night, I woke up to the sound of someone walking in the hallway outside my room. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, pausing every few steps as if the person was listening for something. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand and saw that it was just past 2 a.m. The steps stopped right outside my door, and for a long moment there was complete silence. I held my breath, waiting to hear the sound of a key or the creak of the floorboards moving away. Instead, the doorknob rattled, as if someone was testing if it was locked. My stomach tightened, and I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. The rattling stopped, followed by the faint sound of breathing just beyond the door. I didn't dare move, afraid that whoever was outside would hear me. Minutes passed, and eventually the footsteps retreated down the hall. I waited until I could no longer hear them before getting up and turning on the light. I checked the door, making sure it was locked, then stood there, listening to the silence that had returned to the building. The next morning I asked the receptionist if anyone else was staying on my floor. She shook her head and said I was the only guest in that section of the inn. When I mentioned hearing footsteps, she hesitated before admitting that other guests had reported the same thing. Some even claimed to hear whispers through the walls, though no one had ever seen anything. That evening, I decided to leave my room door slightly open, just enough to see into the hallway. I wanted to prove to myself that it was just the old building settling, that there was nothing unusual happening. I turned off the light and lay in bed, staring at the sliver of darkness visible through the cracked door. The hours passed, and at some point I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of footsteps again, slow and measured, just like before. My heart pounded as I turned my head toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. A shadow moved past the opening, tall and deliberate, but completely silent beyond the sound of footsteps. I squeezed my eyes shut, unwilling to see more. When I finally gathered the courage to open my eyes, the hallway was empty. The door, which I had left slightly open, was now wide open. I sat up, feeling an overwhelming sense of unease wash over me. Something wasn't right, and I needed to leave. I packed my bag in a rush, barely bothering to zip it up before grabbing my key and stepping into the hallway. The air felt heavy, and every creak of the wooden floor seemed amplified. As I neared the staircase, I glanced back toward my room and felt a cold chill rush over me. The door was closed again. I practically ran down the stairs, my pulse racing as I reached the front desk. The receptionist looked up, unsurprised by my panicked state. She nodded before I could even say anything and reached under the desk, pulling out a small notepad. She slid it across the counter, and I saw my name written at the top. She told me that nearly every guest who had stayed in that room left early, usually before sunrise. Some refused to speak about their experiences, while others mentioned the same footsteps and strange presence in the hall. She said she had stopped assigning that room unless absolutely necessary. I wanted to ask why, but I already knew the answer. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, grounding me back to reality. I turned back one last time and saw the window of my room, the curtains drawn closed. I told myself I had imagined everything, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I never booked another stay in an old inn again. For years, I tried to convince myself that it had been my imagination. I avoided reading about the inn, not wanting to fuel the paranoia that had followed me since that night. But one evening, curiosity got the best of me, and I searched for any mentions of the place online. The first article that appeared made my stomach drop. It detailed the history of the inn, focusing on room 208, the very room I had stayed in. Decades earlier, a man had died in that room under unexplained circumstances. Guests claimed to hear footsteps, whispers, and even see the door open and close on its own. One couple reported waking up to the sensation of someone standing next to their bed, only to find the room empty. I scrolled through the comments, reading accounts from others who had experienced the same chilling events. One person described the rattling doorknob and the slow footsteps in the hallway. Another mentioned seeing a shadow pass by the door, just like I had. The more I read, the harder it became to dismiss my experience as a trick of the mind. Even now, I find myself double-checking my bedroom door before I sleep. Some nights I wake up suddenly, convinced I've heard slow, deliberate footsteps outside my door. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from that inn. I don't think I'll ever truly be alone again. Story 3. I had never believed in haunted places until I took a job renovating an old house on the outskirts of a small town in Virginia. The house had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. The locals avoided it, calling it cursed, but I chalked that up to superstition. The pay was good, and I had no reason to refuse. The first time I stepped inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of decay clung to the walls. The wooden floor creaked under my boots, and my flashlight cast long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Most of the furniture was gone. but remnants of the past remained: a broken rocking chair, a stained mattress, and a few framed photographs left behind. I felt an odd sense of unease, but I ignored it and got to work. My job was to strip the place down and prepare it for a full renovation. The first few days were uneventful, though the house had an unsettling stillness. The wind outside made the old boards groan, and the occasional rustling of rodents in the walls kept me on edge. At night, I stayed in a small trailer nearby, relieved to leave the house behind when the sun went down. On the fourth day, I was removing the boards from the windows in what had once been the living room. As I pried the last one loose, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass. A dark figure stood in the hallway behind me, motionless. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, but the hall was empty. The air felt colder, but I told myself it was my imagination. That night, as I lay in my trailer, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept thinking about the figure I had seen in the reflection. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but something deep inside told me otherwise. Sleep came slowly, and even then, it was restless. The next morning, I returned to the house early, determined to finish as quickly as possible. As I walked through the front door, I immediately noticed something was off. The tools I had left in the living room were scattered across the floor. Some had been moved to the opposite side of the room, as if someone had been in there during the night. I checked the doors and windows, but they were still locked from the inside. I tried to shake it off and continued working. Around midday, I was in the upstairs hallway, pulling down a section of damaged plaster, when I uncovered a small wooden door. It was built into the wall, no taller than 3 feet, and had been nailed shut. Something about it made my skin crawl, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pried the nails loose and slowly pulled the door open. A narrow crawl space stretched into darkness, the air inside damp and stale. I shone my flashlight inside and saw that the space was lined with old newspapers, their edges curled and yellowed with age. In the center of the crawl space was a small wooden chair. The sight of it made my stomach turn, though I didn't know why. I stepped back, suddenly feeling like I had made a mistake opening that door. That night, the dream started. I saw the house as it once was, filled with people, their faces blurred and indistinct. The air was thick with tension, a sense of something lurking just beyond my vision. I woke up drenched in sweat, the silence of my trailer pressing in around me. The uneasy feeling from the day before had only grown stronger. The next morning, I found the small door in the hallway open again, even though I had shut it before leaving. I told myself I must have forgotten, but the thought didn't sit right with me. As I worked, I felt the sensation of being watched grow stronger. Every time I turned, there was nothing there, but the feeling never left me. That evening, I stayed later than usual, determined to finish removing the damaged flooring. As I worked, I heard a faint sound coming from upstairs. It was a soft creaking, rhythmic, like the slow movement of a rocking chair. My stomach tightened as I realized it was coming from the hallway where I had found the small door. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way up the stairs. The air felt heavier with each step, the creaking sound continuing at an even pace. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw the small wooden chair inside the crawl space, now facing the doorway. The moment my flashlight beam touched it, the creaking stopped. A sharp chill ran down my spine as I backed away, my heart pounding. I slammed the small door shut and nailed it closed, my hands shaking. I didn't know what was happening in that house, but I no longer wanted to be part of it. I gathered my things and left, determined not to return. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed the events of the day over and over. The creaking chair, the The feeling of being watched, the way my tools had been moved. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but I knew deep down that something was wrong with that house. The next morning, I called the property owner and told them I couldn't continue the job. I didn't offer an explanation, and they didn't ask for one. As I packed up my trailer, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Whatever was in that house, I was leaving it behind. Years later, I heard that the renovations had been completed, but the new owners didn't stay long. Rumors spread that they left in the middle of the night, abandoning the house just like those before them. No one knew why, but I had a feeling I did. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some doors should stay closed. Story 4. I took a job cleaning out an old motel just outside of town, a place that had been abandoned for over 20 years. The owner, an older man who had inherited the property, wanted to sell the land but needed the building cleared out first. He offered me good money to do the job alone, saying he couldn't find anyone else willing to step foot inside. I didn't understand why at the time, but I should have asked more questions. The first time I walked into the motel, the air was stale, thick with the scent of rotten dust. The front desk was still intact, covered in old receipts and ledgers from the last guests who had stayed there. The key rack behind the counter had several rusted keys still hanging, each one labeled with a room number. I ran my fingers along the counter and noticed something strange. There was still a small bell sitting there, its metal dull with age. I started my work in the main office, clearing out old paperwork and broken furniture. It was tedious, but nothing felt out of the ordinary at first. The floors creaked under my weight, and the wind outside made the loose shutters bang against the walls. The only thing that unsettled me was the silence. It wasn't the normal quiet of an empty building. It felt thicker, like the air itself was holding its breath. After the office, I moved on to the rooms, starting with those nearest the front. Most of them were stripped bare, the beds gone, the wallpaper peeling in long curling strips. Some rooms still had furniture, though it was covered in thick layers of dust and mold. One room had a suitcase left behind, its fabric eaten through by time. I unzipped it out of curiosity and found old clothes, neatly folded, as if someone had expected to return. I kept working late into the evening, wanting to finish as much as I could before heading home. As I moved to the next room, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar, even though I hadn't touched it yet. I pushed it open and stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. The air in this room was colder than the others, and a faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered despite the years of abandonment. On the bedside table, an ashtray sat undisturbed, a single cigarette resting on the edge, as if someone had just put it down. That was impossible. The motel had been abandoned for decades. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I backed out of the room, my pulse quickening. I forced myself to move on, but the unease stuck with me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that motel. I told myself it was just my imagination, the effect of working in a place left to decay. Still, as I lay in bed at home, I kept seeing that cigarette in my mind, unburned, waiting. It was enough to keep me awake for hours. The next morning, I returned with a renewed sense of determination. I told myself I wouldn't let a weird feeling get to me. I focused on clearing out the rest of the rooms, moving through them as quickly as possible. Everything was fine until I reached the last room at the end of the hall. The door was locked, and the key was missing from the rack at the front desk. I searched through the pile of keys I had collected but found nothing that matched the number on the door. Frustrated, I decided to leave it for last and continued working. But as I turned away, I heard the faintest sound, something soft, like the rustling of fabric or the shifting of weight on an old mattress. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound had come from inside that locked room. I knocked hesitantly, my voice unsteady as I called out that there was no answer. The silence stretched too long, pressing in around me. I left the hallway, deciding that whatever was inside I didn't need to know. I spent the rest of the afternoon finishing up, but I couldn't stop glancing back toward that locked door. I knew I had to check inside before I left for good. Before the sun went down, I went back to the front desk and searched through the drawers one last time. Eventually, I found a single, unlabeled key at the back of the lowest drawer. I held it for a long moment before heading back down the hall. The key fit perfectly. The lock clicked open with a soft, reluctant sound, and I slowly pushed the door inward. The air inside was thick and suffocating, as if it hadn't moved in years. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the room, taking in the sight before me. Unlike the other rooms, this one was untouched. The bed was still made, the blankets smooth, the pillows undisturbed. A suitcase sat in the corner, closed but not dusty like the one I had found earlier. On the nightstand, an old rotary phone rested beside a small notepad, its top page torn away. Then I noticed the closet door. It was slightly open. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the door open the rest of the way. Inside, hanging from the metal rod, was a single dark suit, its fabric pristine, as if it had been waiting. But the part that sent a chill through me was the shoes. A pair of polished black shoes sat neatly on the floor beneath the suit, pointed toward the bed. It looked as if someone had been standing there, waiting, before simply vanishing. I stepped back, a deep, primal fear settling into my bones. I didn't finish clearing that room. I left the motel without looking back, locking the door behind me. I returned the keys to the owner and told him the job was done, but I never mentioned what I had found. He didn't ask, and I didn't offer. A year later, the motel was torn down. I read about it in the paper, a small article buried in the back pages. No one bought the land after that. It sat empty, growing over with weeds, forgotten by time. I never drove past that place again. Some buildings aren't abandoned. They're left behind, and whatever remains inside them stays waiting. Story 5. I took a job as a night security guard for an old office building on the edge of the city. The building had been mostly abandoned for years, with only one law firm still renting space on the first floor. My job was simple: walk through the halls a few times, make sure no one had broken in, and watch the security cameras until morning. It sounded easy, but after my first night I knew something about the place wasn't right. The first thing I noticed was the elevator. It still worked, even though most of the upper floors were empty. The law firm only used the first floor, and no one ever had a reason to go higher. But every night, the elevator doors would open by themselves. I would be sitting at my desk, watching the monitors, when I'd hear the ding of the elevator arriving on the first floor. I'd check the cameras, but no one would be inside. At first, I assumed it was a mechanical issue. The building was old, and maybe the wiring was faulty. But then I started hearing footsteps in the halls when I knew I was alone. I'd do my rounds, checking each floor, making sure all the doors were locked and everything was in place. But as soon as I returned to my desk, I'd hear its slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the upper floors. The worst was the fourth floor. Unlike the other levels, which were just dusty and empty, the fourth floor still had furniture left behind from the previous tenants. Old desks, broken chairs, and filing cabinets sat in the dimly lit rooms untouched for years. The entire floor smelled of stale air and something else, something faintly metallic. Every time I stepped onto that floor, I felt like I was being watched. One night around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my skin crawl. I was reviewing the camera feeds when I heard a door slam somewhere above me. The sound was loud, echoing through the empty building. I grabbed my flashlight and started up the stairs, my heart pounding with every step. I reached the 4th floor and hesitated before stepping inside. The air felt heavier than usual, thick and unmoving. I walked down the hallway, shining my light into each empty office. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I reached the last room at the end of the hall. The door was wide open, even though I was sure it had been shut before. I stepped inside, scanning the room with my flashlight, but it was empty, just the same old desks and chairs covered in dust. Then, just as I turned to leave, I heard the sound of paper rustling. I swung my flashlight toward the desk in the corner. A single sheet of paper sat on its surface, though I was certain the desk had been empty before. I stepped closer, my breath catching as I read the words written in shaky handwriting. "Who's watching the cameras now, oh?" I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. My first instinct was to check the security feed, but the only way to do that was to get back downstairs. I didn't want to turn my back on that room, but I forced myself to move, walking as quickly as I could without breaking into a full sprint. I made it to the stairwell, rushing down the steps 2 at a time, and practically fell into my chair at the security desk. The monitors flickered as I scanned the feeds, my hands shaking. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The empty hallways, the silent offices, everything was as it should be. But then, movement on the 4th floor camera caught my eye. The room I had just left, the one with the note, had someone standing inside. It was a man, or at least the shadow of one. The figure stood near the desk, unmoving, its head slightly tilted as if watching me through the camera. My breath hitched as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. Then, without warning, the figure took a slow step forward, out of view of the camera. I bolted from my chair. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. There was no way I was going back up there. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building owner, my fingers trembling. It rang a few times before he answered, his voice groggy with sleep. I told him what had happened, expecting him to dismiss it, but instead there was a long silence. Finally, he sighed and said, "You should leave. Lock up and don't come back." His response stunned me. I asked him what he meant, but he just repeated himself. "Lock up and don't come back." Then he hung up. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things, locked the front doors, and walked away from that building without looking back. The next day, I did some research. The office building had once belonged to a private investigation firm, but one of the detectives had gone missing inside. No one ever found his body, just his office left exactly as it had been the day he disappeared. The 4th floor had been sealed off for years, but eventually the locks were removed, and people stopped asking questions. I never went back to that job. The owner never called me again, and I never tried to find out more about what had happened there. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. If I had waited just a little longer watching the cameras, would I have seen that figure move closer? Would it have made its way down to me? I don't want to know, and I never will. Story 6. I took a job renovating an old motel on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, left to decay under layers of dust and neglect. The owner had big plans to restore it, but most of the local contractors refused to work there. The few who did warned me to leave before I got too invested, but I shrugged off their stories. The motel sat on a lonely stretch of highway surrounded by dry, empty fields. It was a single-story building with a row of 12 rooms, all of them in varying states of disrepair. The roof sagged in places, the paint had peeled away, and the sign out front barely held on to its last few letters. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and old wood, like something had been rotting for years. My first few nights working there were uneventful. I focused on clearing out debris, fixing the plumbing, and patching holes in the walls. I stayed in one of the less damaged rooms while I worked, using a generator for power since the electricity hadn't been fully restored yet. It wasn't comfortable, but I'd done worse jobs. Then, one night I heard it. A knocking sound. At first I thought it was the wind rattling the old wooden doors, but when I sat up and listened, I realized it was coming from room 6. I knew I was the only one there, and none of the doors should have been unlocked. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cool night air. Room 6 was one of the worst off. Half of its ceiling had caved in, and the floor was warped from water damage. The door was still locked, just as I had left it. But as I stood there, the knocking came again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate rhythm, as if someone was waiting for me to answer. I hesitated before unlocking the door. The air inside was heavy with dampness, and the walls were covered in deep scratches, as if someone had raked their nails across them in desperation. I stepped inside, scanning the empty room with my flashlight, but nothing seemed out of place. Then, just as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. A single chair sat in the corner, facing the door. It hadn't been there before I was sure of it. I walked over to inspect it, but the moment my hand brushed the wooden backrest, I heard the sound of footsteps outside. I rushed back to the doorway, shining my light into the darkness, but the lot was empty. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, but nothing moved. The next morning, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of working alone in an abandoned building for too long. But as I continued my work, I found more unsettling things. Old newspapers stacked neatly in one of the rooms, all dated from 1987. A half-eaten meal left untouched in room 9, as if someone had just walked away from it. And then there were the voices. It started faint, like a whisper drifting through the hall. I would be working, hammering away at a broken wall, when I'd hear it someone speaking just beyond my line of sight. The first time I thought it was a passing car radio. But there were no cars, no people, just me and the empty motel. One night, as I was finishing up some repairs in the front office, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the building. I jumped, nearly dropping my tools. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried out, following the noise. The hallway was silent, but one door was open, room 12, the last room at the far end. I had checked that room earlier, making sure it was locked. Now the door stood open, revealing darkness inside. My flashlight flickered as I stepped closer, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I hesitated, then stepped over the threshold. The air inside was freezing, colder than any other part of the motel, and then I saw it. On the wall opposite the bed, words had been scratched into the paint, "Don't stay." The letters were jagged and uneven, as if carved with something sharp. My breath hitched as I reached out, running my fingers over the indentations. The paint flaked away beneath my touch, revealing older scratches underneath layer upon layer of the same warning, written over and over. I left that night. I locked up my tools, packed my things, and drove to the nearest motel in town. I told myself I was just tired, that the isolation was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that place. The next day, I returned with every intention of quitting. I planned to tell the owner I wouldn't continue the job, that the place was beyond saving. But when I pulled into the lot, something stopped me. The door to room 6, the room where I had first heard the knocking, was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure I had locked it. My chest tightened as I stepped out of my truck, my keys clutched in my hand. I walked slowly toward the open door, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. When I reached the doorway, I stopped cold. The chair was gone. The room was empty, just as it had been when I first arrived. But the floor was different. A thick layer of dust covered everything, except for a single set of footprints leading from the doorway to the center of the room. They stopped abruptly, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. That was enough for me. I turned around, walked straight to my truck, and left without looking back. I called the owner later that day and told him I wouldn't be returning. He didn't seem surprised. He just sighed and said, "You lasted longer than most." I never found out what happened in that motel, and I don't want to know. But sometimes when I drive past that stretch of highway, I glance at the abandoned building, and I swear I see a shadow standing in the doorway, watching, waiting. Story 7. I used to work as a security guard for an old hospital that had been shut down for years. The building was massive, with 6 floors and a basement, all left to decay after funding had run out. My job was simple: walk the halls, check for squatters, and make sure no one broke in. The pay was decent, and I didn't mind the solitude, but from the moment I stepped inside, I knew something felt off. The air was thick with the smell of old disinfectant and dust, and the floors creaked under my boots no matter how lightly I stepped. During the day, the place looked like any other abandoned building: peeling paint, broken ceiling tiles, and graffiti covering the walls. But at night, when the power was off and the only light came from my flashlight, the place felt different. It was as if something unseen was watching, waiting for me to notice. The first few weeks were uneventful. I made my rounds, checking each floor and shining my light into darkened rooms. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional drip of water or the scurrying of rats in the walls. I always felt like I wasn't alone, but I chalked it up to nerves. That changed one night when I heard footsteps coming from the second floor. It was around 2 in the morning, and I had just finished checking the basement. As I started up the stairwell, I heard the distinct sound of shoes against tile, slow and deliberate. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The steps continued for a few seconds, then stopped as if whoever was walking had realized I was there. I called out, announcing myself as security, but there was no response. My first thought was that a trespasser had found a way in, so I tightened my grip on my flashlight and moved toward the hallway. The dim beam of light barely cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead. I swept it across the open doorways, looking for any sign of movement. Then, at the end of the hall, I saw it. A door slowly swinging shut. My stomach dropped. That door had been wide open during my last check. I walked toward it cautiously, my footsteps echoing against the empty walls. When I reached it, I pushed it open and shined my light inside. The room was empty, just an old patient room with a broken bed and an overturned chair. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there only moments before. I checked every corner, even inside the small bathroom, but there was no one. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it breathing. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. A slow, ragged inhale, followed by a strained exhale. My body went rigid, my pulse hammering in my ears. I swung my flashlight around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. The breathing continued, growing closer, yet there was no source. I bolted. I didn't stop until I reached the first floor, my chest heaving from adrenaline. I forced myself to regain control, reminding myself that fear could make the mind play tricks. but deep down I knew what I had heard was real. After that night, things only got worse. I started hearing doors slam in the distance, always too far for me to reach in time. I'd find chairs moved in hallways I hadn't been through yet, and I'd hear faint whispers echoing through the stairwell. Once, while checking the third floor, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a dark figure standing just inside a doorway. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. One night, as I was doing my rounds on the fourth floor, my radio crackled to life with static. I hadn't touched it, and there was no one else working that shift. The static lasted for a few seconds before cutting out. Then a single word came through, clear as day: leave. My blood ran cold. The voice was low, almost distorted, and it sent a chill through my entire body. I grabbed the radio, trying to respond, but there was nothing but silence. I told myself it was interference, maybe a rogue signal from another frequency, but I knew better. Something didn't want me there. I considered quitting after that, but I needed the job, so I stayed, ignoring the unease that grew stronger with each shift. Then, one night, I made a mistake. I went into the basement alone. The basement had always unsettled me. It was where the hospital stored old equipment, broken stretchers, and rusted wheelchairs, all left to gather dust. But there was something else down there, something I could feel watching me from the moment I stepped inside. As I walked past rows of decaying furniture, I heard a noise behind me. A faint scraping sound, like metal dragging against concrete. I turned, shining my light, but the hallway was empty. My pulse quickened as I took a step forward. The sound came again, closer this time. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A wheelchair, sitting against the far wall, rolled forward an inch. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, my mind racing for a logical explanation. There was no draft, no slope in the floor, nothing that could have caused it to move on its own. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Then, without warning, the wheelchair shot across the room, crashing against the far wall with a deafening clang. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, sprinting up the stairs 2 at a time. When I reached the main floor, I locked myself in the security office, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I sat there until my shift ended, refusing to step foot outside until daylight. That was my last night working at the hospital. I quit the next morning, making up an excuse about personal reasons. The supervisor didn't argue, he just nodded, as if he had expected it. As I walked out for the last time, I glanced back at the hospital, half expecting to see something staring at me from one of the broken windows. I never went back, but sometimes I dream about that place. In my dreams, I'm walking through the halls, my flashlight flickering as unseen eyes watch from the darkness. And no matter how hard I try, I can never find my way out. Story 8. I took a temporary job restoring an old Victorian mansion that had been abandoned for decades. The property was massive, surrounded by overgrown trees and a rusted iron gate that barely held together. The house itself was in a state of disrepair, peeling wallpaper, rotting wood, and a heavy layer of dust covering every surface. My job was simple: clean out debris, make notes of structural damage, and help prepare it for renovation. The first day went by without anything strange happening. I worked mostly on the first floor, sweeping broken glass and clearing out old furniture. The mansion was eerily quiet, except for the occasional groan of shifting wood. Even in broad daylight, the place felt unsettling, like I wasn't supposed to be there. By the second day, I had to start checking the upper floors. The grand staircase was lined with portraits of the original owners, their faded eyes watching as I made my way up. Some of the rooms had furniture still intact, covered in thick white sheets. Others were stripped bare, exposing the skeletal remains of the house. While clearing out a bedroom, I found a small wooden rocking chair near the window. It was old but looked sturdy, and something about it unsettled me. I moved it to the hallway, planning to take it downstairs, but when I turned back to the room, the chair was back where I'd found it. I frowned, trying to remember if I had actually moved it. I grabbed it again, this time placing it in the center of the room before stepping out. When I turned back, the chair was rocking, slowly back and forth. I left the room immediately, my heart pounding as I forced myself to keep working. I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that the house settling had caused the movement, but deep down I knew better. As the days went on, the unease grew worse. Doors I had propped open would be shut when I returned. My tools would disappear, only to be found in different rooms. I started hearing noises, faint shuffling sounds like someone walking barefoot on the wooden floors. Once, while in the dining room, I heard the distinct sound of whispering, though I was completely alone. On the fourth day, I was working late, trying to finish clearing the second floor. I had just placed my flashlight on a dresser when I heard a soft knock from inside the closet. I froze, my body tense as I stared at the door. The knock came again, followed by a slow creak as the door opened an inch. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was just the old hinges shifting, but then something moved. A shadow, small and low to the ground, slipped from the closet into the dark corner of the room. I ran out of there so fast I nearly tripped down the stairs. I refused to go back upstairs that night, finishing my work in the front parlor instead. The entire time I felt like I was being watched. The next morning, I told my supervisor that I didn't want to work alone anymore. He gave me a strange look but agreed to have another worker join me. That day, an older man named Greg came along. He had been with the company for years and had worked on dozens of restorations. We spent the day working on the upper floors together, and for a while, everything seemed fine. But in the late afternoon, Greg suddenly stopped in the middle of the hallway, his face going pale. I asked him what was wrong, but he just shook his head. "I thought I saw something," he muttered. I pressed him for details, but he refused to say more. He worked faster after that, moving as if he wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. That night, I stayed later than usual to finish my checklist. I kept my music on to drown out the silence, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was nearby. I was working in the library when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs, slow, deliberate. I turned off my music and listened. The steps continued, moving across the ceiling above me. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the staircase. My hands felt clammy, my heart pounding against my ribs. The house was supposed to be empty. No one else was scheduled to work that late. But as I climbed the stairs, the footsteps stopped. I reached the second floor and swept my flashlight down the hallway. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. Then I heard breathing. Not my own, something else. It was coming from the far end of the hall, near the room with the rocking chair. I stepped forward, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door to the room was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my flashlight trembling. The chair was moving again, rocking back and forth with a slow, steady rhythm. But there was no wind, no draft, nothing that could have caused it. I was about to turn and leave when I heard something behind me. A soft shuffle like bare feet against wood. I spun around, shining my light down the hallway. For a brief moment I saw it. A figure, small and hunched, standing at the far end of the hall. Its features were obscured by darkness, but I could see its outline. the way it seemed to shift and blend with the shadows. Then, in an instant, it was gone. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my car keys. I didn't care about finishing my shift. I didn't care about the job. I just needed to get away. The next day, I called in sick. I wasn't going back. But curiosity got the better of me, and I started researching the history of the house. What I found made my blood run cold. The mansion had once belonged to a wealthy family in the early 1900s. They had a young daughter who was often sick and rarely left her room. One winter, she disappeared without a trace. The family claimed she had wandered off into the woods and gotten lost, but rumors spread that she had died inside the house and that her parents had hidden the truth. Years later, when new owners moved in, strange things began happening. Furniture would be moved, whispers heard in the hallways, and a small shadowy figure seen in the upstairs rooms. Several families left the house in fear before it was abandoned completely. I never went back, but sometimes I still dream about that place. In my dreams, I'm standing in the upstairs hallway, listening to the sound of a rocking chair moving in the darkness. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of my vision, something is watching, waiting. Story 9. I moved into an old boarding house in New Orleans, lured by its affordable rent and historic charm. The building had once been a grand residence in the early 1900s, but had since been divided into small apartments. The landlord mentioned its age, warning me about creaky floors and occasional plumbing issues, but nothing about what I would soon experience. I wasn't superstitious, so I didn't think twice about the house's past. My first night there, I noticed how unsettlingly quiet it was. The thick walls muted the sounds of the outside world, making every small noise within the apartment more pronounced. As I lay in bed, I heard soft tapping against the wall near my headboard. I assumed it was the pipes or an issue with the old wood settling. A few nights later, I was working late when I heard shuffling footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. I thought it was one of my neighbors, but when I checked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The building had security doors that locked automatically, and my neighbor was out of town, so I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. One evening, I fell asleep on the couch while reading. I woke up suddenly to the distinct sound of someone whispering my name. It was soft but clear, coming from just a few feet away. My apartment was small, and I knew no one else was inside. My stomach tightened as I scanned the room, but everything was as I left it. Strange things started happening more frequently. My keys would disappear, only to turn up in odd places, like inside my refrigerator or under my bed. My closet door, which I always kept shut, would sometimes be slightly open when I came home. One night, I locked my bedroom door before going to bed, but when I woke up, it was wide open. Determined to find an explanation, I spoke to the landlord about the building's history. He seemed hesitant to share details but admitted that tenants rarely stayed long. People complain about noises, he said, but it's an old house. When I pressed further, he sighed and told me about a woman who had lived there decades ago. She had been a nurse in the 1940s, living alone after her fiancé was killed in the war. Neighbors described her as kind but deeply sad, often seen standing at her window at night. One winter, she stopped leaving her apartment altogether. A mailman noticed her letters piling up and reported it to the landlord. When they entered her apartment, they found her sitting in a chair by the window, lifeless. Hearing this unsettled me, but I convinced myself it was just an eerie story. That changed when I saw something with my own eyes. One night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw a shadow in the doorway. It wasn't a trick of the light. I could make out the shape of a woman standing there, motionless. I reached for my phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. When I looked back at the doorway, the figure was gone. My breathing was ragged as I jumped out of bed and turned on every light in the apartment. I barely slept that night, and in the morning, I noticed something chilling on the dusty wooden floor near my bed were faint footprints. From that point on, I felt an unshakable presence in my apartment. It was as if I was never truly alone. Some nights I'd wake up with an overwhelming sense of sadness that wasn't my own. I started keeping a notebook by my bed to jot down anything unusual. One night, as I was writing, my pen suddenly slid across the table on its own. I stared at it, my body frozen with fear. I confided in a friend who was familiar with paranormal activity. She suggested I try speaking to whatever was in my apartment. I thought it was ridiculous, but out of desperation I gave it a try. One evening I sat on my couch and said, "I don't know who you are, but I know you're here. If you need something, let me know." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, just as I was about to give up, a single knock sounded from the closet door. I felt a chill run through me, but I didn't move. A few minutes later, another knock. That night, I dreamed of a woman sitting by my window, looking out into the street with vacant eyes. The final straw came a week later. I had just returned from work when I found my apartment in complete disarray. Drawers were pulled open, papers were scattered across the floor, and my chair was turned to face the window. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. I backed out of the apartment and spent the night at a friend's place. I decided to break my lease and move out. On my last night there, I sat in the empty living room, waiting for a moving truck. I felt a presence behind me and turned, half expecting to see her. Instead, I saw my reflection in the darkened window only. Just behind me there was the faint outline of a woman's face. I rushed out without looking back. I never told the landlord what I saw, knowing he'd only shrug it off. After moving out, I learned from another former tenant that they had experienced the same eerie events. I don't know if she was trying to communicate or if she was simply stuck in a place that held too much pain. All I know is that whatever was in that apartment never truly left. Story 10. The old mansion on the outskirts of town had always been a place of whispered rumors. It stood alone, surrounded by dead trees in an overgrown yard, its windows dark and empty. For years, no one had lived there, and those who dared to approach spoke of an uneasy feeling, like something unseen was watching. When I was 21, I was hired by the new owner to clean it out before renovations began. I arrived early in the morning, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that made the air feel colder than it should have. The front door was heavy, its brass handle worn from years of use, and when I pushed it open, the hinges groaned loudly. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something stale and suffocating. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its wooden steps covered in a layer of grime, leading up into darkness. The first floor was in shambles. Furniture lay scattered, broken and forgotten, while the walls bore deep scratches, as if someone had dragged something sharp across them. The kitchen was worse, the cabinets hanging open, their contents long gone except for rusted silverware and a single plate left on the counter. The floor was covered in dirt, and as I stepped forward, something crunched beneath my boot. I knelt and picked up a small shard of glass. Looking around, I saw more pieces scattered as if a mirror had been shattered. There was no sign of the frame or the rest of it, just those tiny, jagged remains. A sudden chill crept up my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already overstayed my welcome. I told myself I was being paranoid and continued working. Hours passed, and the sun outside barely made a difference in the gloom that filled the house. I worked in silence, bagging debris and sweeping dust into piles, but every now and then, I would hear something. A faint creak upstairs, a soft rustling in the hallway behind me. Each time I would stop and listen, my pulse quickening, but nothing followed. By early evening I was exhausted, my back aching from lifting furniture and clearing debris. I decided to take a break in the dining room, where an old wooden table still stood, untouched by time. I sat down, rubbing my hands together to warm them, when I heard a slow, deliberate knock coming from upstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like knuckles tapping against wood. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. The house was old, settling in the wind, I told myself. But then it came again. 3 knocks, steady, measured, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I stood up, my hands unsteady as I grabbed the flashlight from my bag. I had to check. The staircase creaked with each step, the wood shifting beneath my weight. At the top, a hallway stretched in both directions, doors lining the walls, some slightly ajar. I shined the flashlight around. The beam cutting through the dust-filled air. The knocking had come from the farthest room on the left, the one with the door slightly open. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle. The wood was cold beneath my fingers. Slowly I pushed it open, the hinges whining as the door swung inward. The room was empty. Nothing but an old bed frame pushed against the far wall, its mattress rotting away. The window was shut, dust coating the glass so thickly that barely any light seeped through. I stepped inside, my boots stirring up small clouds of dust. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and age. I turned to leave, but then I saw it. Faint, almost unnoticeable, but their footprints in the dust leading to the closet. My stomach tightened as I realized that the prints weren't mine. Someone had walked in here recently. I hesitated, every part of me screaming to leave, but something compelled me forward. I reached for the closet door, my fingers trembling as I pulled it open. The space inside was small, empty except for an old coat hanging limply from a rusted hook. But the footprints ended here. Whoever had made them hadn't walked out. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I stepped back quickly, nearly tripping over myself as I turned toward the hallway. The moment I did, the closet door slammed shut behind me with a force that sent dust swirling into the air. I bolted, my pulse thundering in my ears, nearly stumbling down the stairs in my hurry. Back on the first floor, I grabbed my things, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into my bag. I needed to get out. As I turned to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye. In the reflection of an old mirror near the entrance, I saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was barely visible in the dim light, just a dark outline unmoving. I didn't wait. I yanked the door open and stepped outside, gasping as the fresh air hit my lungs. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was at my car, the house looming behind me like a silent predator. My hands were unsteady as I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark figure standing at the top of the stairs, watching me. The next day, I called the owner and told him I wouldn't be coming back. He didn't ask why. Maybe he already knew. A few weeks later, I heard that the renovations had been delayed. The workers refused to stay after dark, complaining of strange noises and the feeling of being watched. Eventually, the owner gave up and put the house back on the market. No one bought it. It still stands there, empty, waiting for the next person foolish enough to step inside. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that house. I tell myself it was just an old building, filled with nothing but shadows and dust. But deep down, I know better. That place wasn't empty, and whatever was inside never wanted me to leave. Story 11. I took a job at a historic hotel that had been shut down for years and was now undergoing renovations. The building was massive, a 5-story structure with grand architecture that had been left to decay. My job was simple: assist with cleaning out old furniture, removing debris, and documenting structural issues. It sounded easy enough, and I wasn't superstitious like some of the older workers who refused to work past sundown. The first few days were uneventful, though the building had an eerie atmosphere. The hallways were long and dimly lit by temporary work lamps, casting shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Many of the rooms had furniture still intact, as if the guests had simply vanished. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood settling. I spent most of my time on the second floor, hauling out broken chairs and dusty rugs. One afternoon, while clearing out a suite, I found an old guest ledger sitting on a desk. Flipping through it, I saw names and dates from decades ago, the ink faded but still legible. Some pages had been torn out, and certain names had been violently scratched out, leaving deep grooves in the paper. That same day, while stacking broken furniture in the hallway, I heard footsteps from the floor above. Slow, deliberate steps, moving from one end of the building to the other. I called out, assuming it was one of the other workers, but no one responded. The footsteps continued for a few more seconds before stopping abruptly. Later, I asked the others if anyone had been working upstairs, but they all shook their heads. One of the older guys, Mark, gave me a serious look. "Stay off the 4th floor," he warned. "We don't work up there." I laughed it off, thinking it was just an old superstition. But something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. That evening, I was alone, finishing up my checklist before heading out. The work lamps flickered as I moved down the hallway, casting shifting shadows on the walls. I was about to lock up when I heard something, a faint humming sound, like a woman's voice, coming from upstairs. It was soft at first, then grew louder, echoing through the stairwell. My body tensed as I turned toward the stairs. The sound was coming from the 4th floor. Every instinct told me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The humming stopped as I reached the landing, replaced by an eerie silence. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with closed doors. The air was colder up here, the dust thicker, untouched for years. I took a few cautious steps forward, shining my flashlight down the corridor. My footfalls echoed, making it sound like I wasn't alone. Then I saw it. One of the doors was slightly open, just a crack. A faint light flickered inside, though I knew for a fact that none of the work lamps had been set up on this floor. I hesitated before stepping closer, peering inside. The room was in disarray, furniture overturned, the wallpaper peeling in long strips. In the corner stood an old vanity with a large, tarnished mirror. The surface of the mirror was cloudy, the reflection distorted, but as I moved, something in the glass caught my eye. A shape vague, shadowy, standing near the doorway behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. A chill ran down my spine as I turned back to the mirror. The shape was gone, but the uneasy feeling remained. I left the room, shutting the door behind me, and hurried down the stairs without looking back. The next day, I arrived early, determined to put the night's events behind me. I avoided the 4th floor and focused on clearing out the lobby. As I moved an old trunk, something inside shifted, making a soft thudding noise. Curious, I pried it open, coughing as a cloud of dust billowed out. Inside were stacks of faded photographs, bundled together with brittle string. I picked up one of the photos and felt my stomach drop. It was a picture of the hotel lobby taken decades ago. In the background, near the grand staircase, stood a woman in a long, dark dress. Her face was blurred, but something about her posture was unsettling. As I flipped through more photos, I noticed her appearing in several of them, always standing in the background, always slightly out of focus. I showed the pictures to Mark, who turned pale. "That's her," he muttered. "The woman from room 414. I asked him what he meant, and he reluctantly told me the story. Decades ago, a woman named Evelyn had been a long-term guest at the hotel. She was said to be waiting for her fiancé, a businessman who had promised to return for her, but he never did. She spent years in room 414, slowly deteriorating, refusing to leave. One night, the staff found her dead, sitting at her vanity, still wearing the same dress she had worn the night he left. After her death, strange things started happening. Guests reported seeing a woman wandering the halls late at night, humming softly to herself. Others claimed to hear knocking from inside room 414, even when it was unoccupied. Eventually, the hotel shut down, and Evelyn's story became nothing more than a ghost tale among the workers. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every noise made me jump. Every flicker of the lights made my skin crawl. As I was locking up, I glanced toward the staircase and froze. At the top of the stairs, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, stood a figure. She was barely visible, more of a shadow than a person, but I could make out the outline of a long dress. My breath caught in my throat as she moved, her head tilting slightly as if watching me. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. I left without finishing my checklist, refusing to stay another minute. The next morning, I told my supervisor I was quitting. I didn't give a reason, and he didn't ask. Maybe he already knew. Months later, I heard that the renovations had stopped. The company pulled out of the project, and the hotel remained abandoned. People still talk about it, about the woman who never left. And sometimes when I drive past that empty building, I swear I can hear it, the faint sound of humming drifting through the night. Story 12. I moved into a small rental house just outside of Savannah, Georgia. It was an old place, built sometime in the early 1900s, with weathered wooden floors and antique fixtures. The landlord had told me it had been vacant for nearly a year, but everything worked fine. I was excited to have a place to myself, unaware of what I had just walked into. The first night was quiet, but I noticed how the house seemed to hold on to sounds. Even when I was still, there was always a faint creaking, like the walls were adjusting. I chalked it up to the house's age and went to bed early. I had no idea that sleep would soon become a rare luxury. A week in, I began waking up at odd hours, feeling as if someone was standing near my bed. Each time I found nothing. The air in the room would be strangely heavy, as if it were pressing down on me. I started keeping my phone by my bed, convinced that I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, its screen glowing in the darkness. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, listening. Slowly the door handle turned, but the door itself didn't open. I leapt out of bed and turned on the light. The door was shut, just as I had left it. There was no one there. I checked the front and back doors, both were locked. The windows hadn't been touched. I stood in my silent house, gripping my phone, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances escalated. I would wake up to find my closet door wide open, even though I never left it that way. My shoes would be rearranged in odd patterns, sometimes facing the wrong direction. Faucets would drip, though I was sure I had turned them off tightly. The worst part was the shadow. I started seeing it out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape that would flicker just at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it in reflections. In the bathroom mirror, I spotted a figure standing in the doorway behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I finally called my landlord and asked if anything strange had ever happened in the house. He hesitated before answering. Some people say it has a bad energy, he admitted. A family lived there in the 1950s. Their son, something happened to him. He wouldn't elaborate, only saying that the house had changed hands frequently since then. Armed with this information, I did some research. I found an old newspaper article about the house. The previous owners had a 7-year-old son named Thomas who had disappeared. His parents had searched for days before finally finding him in the crawl space under the house. The article didn't describe how he died, only that his body had been in an unnatural position. That night, I heard scratching beneath the floorboards. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like nails dragging against wood. My stomach twisted as I realized it was coming from directly below my bed. I grabbed my keys and left, spending the night in my car. I returned the next morning, determined to check under the house. The crawl space entrance was in the backyard, secured by an old, rusted latch. I pried it open and peered inside. The space was small and dark, the ground covered in dead leaves and debris. As I shined my flashlight around, my breath caught in my throat. Deep in the crawl space, I saw the faint impression of a child's handprint in the dirt. It was small, too small to be recent. My skin prickled as I backed away, sealing the entrance shut. I no longer cared about explanations. I just wanted out. The final night in the house was the worst. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard the sound of breathing. It was slow and raspy, just outside my bedroom door. My body froze as I listened, every hair on my skin standing on end. Then, the door handle turned again, just as it had before. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The door was still shut, but now I could see something that made my blood run cold. Scratches lined the wood, jagged and deep, as if someone had been clawing at it from the other side. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my bags, and ran out of the house without looking back. I drove straight to a hotel and called my landlord in the morning. I told him I was breaking the lease and leaving immediately. He didn't argue. It was as if he had been expecting it. A few months later, I drove past the house again out of curiosity. A for rent sign stood in the yard, just as it had when I first found it. The windows were dark, and the house looked just as empty as when I left. I wondered how long it would be before the next tenant moved in before they heard the scratching, the footsteps, the breathing. I don't know what lingers in that house, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever is there is waiting. Story 13. I had just moved into a new apartment in the city, a modest space that felt like a blank canvas, waiting to be filled with memories and a new chapter of my life. The day was sunny, and as I unpacked the last of the boxes, a sense of new beginnings washed over me. The apartment was charming, with its vintage charm and creaky wooden floors. I imagined myself creating a cozy sanctuary here, one where I'd finally find the peace and independence I craved. As I tackled the pile of boxes stacked in the living room, I came across a worn, dusty box. It was small and nondescript, with my name scrawled on it in an uneven, childish handwriting. Curious, I carefully opened it, expecting perhaps old trinkets or forgotten memorabilia from previous moves. Inside, I found a surprising assortment of items that made my heart race with confusion and unease. The box contained several old photographs, their edges curling with age. They depicted scenes I didn't recognize, pictures of a sunny beach, a family picnic, and a group of people laughing together. I scanned the faces in the photos, but none of them seemed familiar. Among these was a stack of letters, each one meticulously folded and sealed with a small wax stamp. The handwriting on these letters was elegant, flowing, and perfectly legible, but the content was baffling. The first letter began with an affectionate salutation and an account of what seemed to be shared memories and experiences, events and details I had no recollection of. As I read through the letters, A sense of dread grew inside me. They spoke of a close friendship, intimate details of shared experiences, and even secrets I had long forgotten. The writer mentioned visiting places I had never been and knowing things about my childhood that seemed eerily accurate. I felt a wave of anxiety as I realized that these were not just random items, they were personal and specific to my life. Each letter was filled with an odd mixture of nostalgia and foreboding. The writer referred to events that I had once thought were private, like the time I had been lost at a summer camp or a family gathering that had ended in an argument. I searched through the rest of the box, hoping to find anything that would explain the connection between me and these unfamiliar objects. The more I looked, the more I felt a sinking sense of invasion. The box was like a puzzle with missing pieces, and no matter how much I tried to fit them together, they left me feeling more confused. Who had sent this box? Why was it here? And why did it seem to hold such a personal significance? Determined to uncover the truth, I started by trying to trace the origin of the box. I contacted the previous owner of the apartment, hoping they might shed some light on the matter. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, seemed surprised when I mentioned the box. She assured me that she had no knowledge of it and had always made sure the apartment was cleared out thoroughly between tenants. With no other leads, I decided to seek out professional help. I took the photographs and letters to a private investigator, hoping they might provide some insight. The investigator examined the items with a careful eye, noting the distinct handwriting and the style of the photographs. He mentioned that the wax seals on the letters were old-fashioned but not particularly unique. It was a dead end. And, feeling frustrated and overwhelmed, I began to investigate on my own. I tried to recall any possible connections or memories that might link me to the sender of these items. I reached out to old friends and family members, asking if they recognized any of the people in the photos or if they knew anything about the letters. Everyone seemed puzzled and had no recollection of these details. One evening, as I was sitting alone in the dimly lit apartment, I picked up the most recent letter from the box. It spoke of a recent event, one that had happened right before my move. It was as if the writer knew about my new apartment before I did. My heart pounded as I realized the implications. Someone had been watching me, or at least keeping track of my life in a way that made me feel profoundly uneasy. Determined to get answers, I decided to confront the previous occupants of the apartment directly. I spent weeks tracking down anyone who had lived there before me. To my surprise, I managed to locate a few former tenants through social media and old community connections. Each person I spoke to was as baffled as I was. None of them claimed to have left the box or had any idea about the contents. One former tenant, a woman named Julia, mentioned that she had lived in the apartment 5 years ago. When I described the box and its contents, her face turned pale. She hesitated before admitting that she had experienced something similar. Julia recounted a strange occurrence when she found a box of personal items in her new apartment, items that didn't belong to her but seemed oddly connected to her past. She had been unnerved and eventually discarded the items, trying to move on. Hearing this, I felt a chilling connection between our experiences. Julia's revelation only deepened the mystery. It seemed that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, unsettling pattern. The sense of being watched or tracked grew stronger. As the weeks went by, I continued to search for answers, trying to piece together the mystery that seemed to intertwine with my new life in the apartment. In the end, I couldn't find any definitive answers. The box remained an enigma, a fragment of a past I couldn't fully understand. It served as a haunting reminder of the secrets and memories that lingered just beyond my grasp. While I had managed to settle into my new apartment, the shadow of that mysterious box lingered, leaving me with an unsettling feeling of having been part of a story I had yet to fully uncover. Story 14. It started on an ordinary Wednesday evening. I had been working late at the office, finishing a report that was due the next day. As usual, I came home, made dinner, and then spent a few minutes checking my personal emails and social media accounts. Everything seemed normal until I noticed a new message in my inbox. It was from an email address I didn't recognize, but the subject line was simply "Hello." Curiosity got the better of me and I opened the message. The text was brief, just a single line. "I see you've been busy." I dismissed it as a prank or spam, though something about it made me uneasy. I decided to go to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would put the unease to rest. Little did I know this was just the beginning. The following morning, I noticed something peculiar. I had trouble logging into my social media accounts. The passwords didn't seem to work. After several unsuccessful attempts, I reset them. As soon as I was back online, I noticed strange posts and messages on my profiles. things I definitely hadn't written. My anxiety started to rise, but I tried to remain calm. I updated my passwords again and scanned my computer for malware, but everything appeared to be fine. That evening, I found another email from the same unknown sender. This time, the subject line read, "Your fears are mine now." I opened it, and this time there was more content. It was a series of cryptic statements that seemed to be tailored to my deepest insecurities. The email referred to my fear of public speaking, my struggles with self-doubt, and even personal experiences that I had never shared online. I felt a chill run down my spine. How could someone know these things about me? I reached out to a few close friends, sharing my concerns and the details of the emails. They were supportive and advised me to be cautious, but they also thought it could be a well-orchestrated prank. I wanted to believe it was just that a joke gone too far. However, as the days passed, the emails continued. Each message grew increasingly detailed, delving into areas of my life that were private and deeply personal. One morning, I received an email with a subject line that read, "Are you watching me too?" The content was a photograph of my apartment building taken from the street, as well as a screenshot of my online calendar showing my work schedule. My heart pounded. I had no idea how this person had access to such specific information. I immediately contacted the police, but their response was cautious. They advised me to keep records of all communications and to maintain heightened security on my accounts. I followed their advice, changing all my passwords and setting up two-factor authentication wherever possible. I also made sure to check my computer and phone for any signs of tampering, but everything seemed to be in order. Still, the emails persisted. They began to include disturbing details about my daily routine. The sender seemed to know when I went to the gym, when I visited the grocery store, and even the names of people I interacted with. It felt like my life was being watched, scrutinized. Each email was a reminder of how vulnerable I was. As weeks went by, I started receiving physical mail as well. Packages arrived with no return addresses, and inside were notes containing more intimate details about my life. One package contained a photograph of me from a public event, taken at a moment when I was visibly distressed. The note attached simply read, "Your pain is my pleasure." The psychological toll was immense. I found it difficult to trust anyone. I questioned whether my friends and colleagues were somehow involved, or if they were being manipulated. I felt isolated. My sense of security eroded. My work performance began to suffer, and I found myself withdrawing from social interactions, constantly on edge. Desperate for answers, I hired a private investigator. The investigator was methodical and thorough, but even with their expertise, tracing the origins of the emails and physical mail proved challenging. The sender had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, using anonymous accounts and untraceable delivery services. One evening, as I was sitting at my desk, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. I hesitated but eventually opened it. The subject line read, "It's time for the final act." The email contained a link to a live stream. With a sinking feeling, I clicked the link and was taken to a video feed. The image was of my own living room, captured from a hidden camera. I could see myself sitting at my desk, my face a mask of fear and confusion. The live stream was interrupted by a new message. "This is the end of the line for you." My heart raced as I looked around my apartment, realizing how vulnerable I was. I grabbed my phone and called the police, who responded quickly. They arrived at my apartment and conducted a thorough search, but found no hidden cameras or other surveillance equipment. Despite their efforts, the emails continued, although they became less frequent. I began to feel a sense of resignation, knowing that the psychological damage had already been done. The experience had fundamentally changed me. I struggled with anxiety and paranoia, always wondering if someone was watching me, if my privacy was being invaded. Eventually, the emails stopped altogether, and the physical mail ceased. I never discovered the identity of the hacker or their motives. The authorities were unable to make any arrests, and the private investigator could only offer vague leads that never panned out. The terror of those months left a lasting mark on me. I learned to live with a heightened sense of vigilance and a wariness of the digital world that had once seemed so benign. In the end, the only thing I could do was try to reclaim my life, piece by piece, and find some semblance of normalcy in a world that had been irrevocably altered by the invasion of my privacy. The fear lingered, a quiet shadow in the corners of my mind, but I hoped that with time, it would become a little less daunting. Story 15. I had spent weeks searching for the perfect escape from the city. When I stumbled upon the old Victorian house nestled in the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, I knew I had found the perfect place. It was advertised as an abandoned relic, untouched for decades, and the solitude it promised was exactly what I needed. The rent was suspiciously low, but I was too desperate for peace to care. The first few days were idyllic. I reveled in the quiet, the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the dusty wooden floors. The house was large and sprawling, with creaking stairs and rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. I explored every inch, my flashlight casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. It was both thrilling and eerie, this grand old home that had been untouched by human hands for so long. But then, on the fifth night, something shifted. As I settled into bed, I heard a soft thump from somewhere in the house. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling, but when it happened again, my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs, moving cautiously through the darkness. I searched the ground floor and found nothing out of the ordinary. I headed upstairs, the creaking floorboards seeming louder than usual. The noise seemed to be coming from the room at the end of the hallway. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding. The door was slightly ajar. I peered inside but saw nothing unusual. I pushed the door open further, and my eyes swept over the dusty room. It looked as if it had been unused for years, except for one thing. There was a faint, lingering smell of something recently burned. I spent the next few days on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. Each creak of the house or flicker of the shadows seemed more ominous. Despite my unease, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The house was old, and it made sounds. This was nothing more than the old wood settling and the wind playing tricks. It wasn't until the following week that I found something that made my blood run cold. I was exploring the attic, a dimly lit space cluttered with old furniture and boxes covered in cobwebs. As I rummaged through a box of old photographs, I noticed a door set into the wall that I hadn't seen before. It was hidden behind a stack of dusty trunks and old paintings. The door was small, almost like a cupboard door, but it had a lock on it. Curiosity and a growing sense of dread drove me to find the key, which I eventually discovered hidden in a drawer in the master bedroom. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room inside was small, barely big enough to stand in. As I stepped inside, my flashlight illuminated the space, revealing walls covered in a chaotic array of photographs and notes. They were all about me. The photographs were a series of candid shots taken from various angles, documenting my daily routines, leaving the house, driving to the store, even sleeping in bed. Each photo was dated and then annotated with a scrawling hand, detailing my activities in unsettling detail. There were also handwritten notes pinned to the wall, describing my movements with a level of detail that made my skin crawl. There were notes about my eating habits, my interactions with the few people I had spoken to in town, and even the times I had left the house. The more I read, the more my sense of reality twisted. Whoever had been in this room had been watching me closely, obsessively. In one corner of the room there was a small table with a collection of items laid out my favorite brand of tea, a half-empty packet of biscuits I had bought, and a book one had left lying around. The sight of these personal items, so intimately connected to my daily life, left me feeling violated and terrified. I spent hours in that hidden room, poring over the notes and photographs. As the hours passed, I became increasingly paranoid. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind seemed to signal that someone was still here, lurking just out of sight. I tried to call the local authorities, but the old phone line had been cut, and my cell phone had no signal. Desperate, I made a plan to leave the house and head to the nearest town for help. But when I went to gather my things, I realized with growing horror that the front door was no longer accessible. The door had been barricaded from the outside, trapping me inside. Panic set in. I searched frantically for another way out, but every window was locked tight, and every other exit was blocked. I was alone, trapped, and the realization that someone had intentionally confined me here sent me into a spiral of fear. I spent the night hiding in the attic, my flashlight illuminating the shadows and every sound sending me into a frenzy. I heard movement below, and the distant sound of someone breathing. I dared not make a sound, paralyzed with terror. As dawn approached, I knew I had to find a way out before my captor, if that's what they were returned. I returned to the hidden room, hoping to find some clue or escape route. It was then that I noticed a small, inconspicuous hatch in the floor, partially obscured by the clutter. With a burst of adrenaline, I managed to pry it open and discovered a narrow crawl space beneath the house. I crawled through the dark, musty space, my mind racing with thoughts of who might be watching me from above. After what felt like hours, I emerged into the open air, outside the perimeter of the house. I sprinted to the nearest neighbor's house, where I was finally able to call the police. The authorities investigated the Victorian house, but they found no signs of recent activity or anyone who had been living there. The hidden room was sealed, and photographs and notes had mysteriously vanished. There were no fingerprints, no evidence of intrusion, nothing to indicate who had been watching me or why. Though the house was now deserted and I had returned to my previous life, the memory of that experience haunted me. The knowledge that someone had been observing my every move, documenting my life in such a personal way, left an indelible mark on my psyche. I never returned to that house, and I never felt safe in the same way again. Story 16. The old farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road, hidden behind overgrown trees and rusting fences. It had been abandoned for years, but recently a friend of mine bought it for next to nothing. He was planning to fix it up and turn it into a rental, but he needed help getting started. That's how I ended up driving out there one weekend, ready to lend a hand. The moment I arrived, I felt uneasy. The house was in worse shape than I expected, with broken windows, rotting wood, and vines creeping up the sides. The air smelled damp, like the earth had been trying to reclaim the place for years. My friend Jake was already there, standing on the front porch with a crowbar in hand. "About time you showed up," he said with a grin. "This place is a mess." I stepped out of my truck and looked up at the house, feeling an inexplicable weight in my chest. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't explain why. Still, I shrugged it off and followed Jake inside. The inside was even worse than the outside. The floors sagged, the walls were covered in grime, and the ceiling had water stains stretching across it like old wounds. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by our movements. The house had been empty for a long time, but it didn't feel empty. We started in the living room, pulling up rotted floorboards and sweeping out piles of debris. As we worked, I kept getting the feeling that someone was watching us. The sensation was strongest near the hallway that led to the back of the house. Every time I glanced down it, I half expected to see someone standing there. By late afternoon, we had made decent progress. Jake decided to check out the basement while I worked on clearing out one of the bedrooms. The door was jammed, so I had to push against it with my shoulder. When it finally gave way, a rush of cold air hit me, carrying the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The room was nearly empty, except for an old wooden dresser and a rocking chair near the window. The chair was facing away from me, but something about it made me pause. It looked like it had been moved recently, the dust disturbed around its legs. I told myself it was just my imagination and started pulling down cobweb-covered wallpaper. Minutes later, I heard Jake's voice from the basement. "Hey, come down here for a second." His voice echoed strangely, making it hard to tell where exactly he was. I left the bedroom and made my way down the creaking wooden stairs. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a small, grimy window near the ceiling. Jake was standing in the middle of the room, staring at something on the floor. As I got closer, I saw what it was: a small pile of bones. At first, I thought they were from an animal, but something about them seemed off. They were old, yellowed with time, and arranged in a strange pattern. "Probably just some raccoon or something," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Still weird, though." I nodded, but my stomach was twisting in knots. The air down here felt heavier, like it was pressing against my skin. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. We decided to call it a day and went upstairs to grab our things. As we were packing up, I heard something from the hallway, the sound of footsteps. I froze, glancing at Jake, who had heard it too. It wasn't the house settling or the wind outside. It was clear, deliberate footsteps. Jake grabbed the crowbar, and we moved toward the sound. The hallway was empty, the doors all open just as we had left them. I checked the bedroom I had been working in, my eyes immediately going to the rocking chair. It was facing the door now. I was sure it had been turned toward the window before. A chill ran down my spine. "Let's go," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Jake hesitated before nodding. We locked up and left, but the whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something. The next day, Jake called me. Man, I don't know if I was just exhausted or what, but I swear something weird happened last night. His voice was uneasy, which wasn't like him. I woke up and my bedroom door was open. I always keep it shut. Thought maybe I forgot, but then I heard something. I gripped my phone tighter. "What did you hear?" There was a pause before he answered. Whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, right outside my door. His voice dropped lower, and my rocking chair was moving, slowly like someone was sitting in it. A cold dread filled my chest. "You need to leave that house alone," I said. "At least for a while." Jake laughed, but it was forced. "Yeah, maybe," but he didn't listen. A few days later, he went back to the farmhouse alone. I got a text from him in the afternoon saying he was going to stay the night there to get more work done. I called him, trying to convince him otherwise, but he waved off my concerns. "I'll be fine," he said. "It's just an old house." That night, just after midnight, my phone rang. It was Jake. When I answered, all I could hear was heavy breathing. "Jake?" I said, but he didn't respond right away. Then, in a shaky voice, he whispered, "There's someone in the house." My blood ran cold. "Get out," I said, already grabbing my keys. "Right now." There was a long silence before he finally spoke again. "I can't. The door won't open." I sped down the empty roads, my hands slick with sweat. I kept him on the phone the whole time, telling him to stay quiet and not move. I could hear something faint in the background, a creaking noise like a chair rocking back and forth. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was completely dark. I ran to the front door, pounding on it, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard Jake's voice from inside. It stopped. There was a loud click, and the door swung open on its own. Jake was standing in the middle of the living room, his face pale, his breathing ragged. He didn't say a word as we ran out to my truck. We never went back. Jake sold the property without stepping foot inside again. The new owners tore the place down within a month, but I still wonder about that house. I wonder if whatever was in there is still there, waiting. Story 17. I got a call about a job from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. He needed help watching over an old motel on the outskirts of town. The place had been shut down for almost a decade, but the owner was considering selling it and wanted someone to make sure no one broke in. It seemed easy enough: sit in a small office, walk the halls a few times, and leave in the morning. The motel, called the Redwood Inn, was a long single-story building with rooms facing an empty parking lot. The neon sign was faded, its letters barely visible beneath years of grime. My friend met me outside and handed me a set of keys. He looked uneasy, shifting on his feet as he spoke. "Just stay inside the office as much as you can," he said. "And if you hear anything, ignore it." I laughed, thinking he was messing with me, but he didn't smile. His expression was serious, almost nervous. He patted my shoulder, muttered something about needing to go, and left without another word. I stood there for a moment, watching his taillights disappear down the empty road. Something about the way he had acted put me on edge. The office was small, with a dusty desk, an old register, and a wall of room keys hanging behind the counter. The security monitor flickered in black and white, showing grainy footage of the motel's exterior and hallways. I settled into the chair, expecting a long, boring night. Around midnight, the power flickered. The lights dimmed for a few seconds before humming back to life. I glanced at the monitor, noticing static on one of the cameras. It was the feed for the hallway outside room 6. The screen jumped, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. A figure, barely visible in the distorted image. I leaned in, trying to get a clearer look, but the static swallowed the figure, leaving the hallway empty. I told myself it was just a glitch. The equipment was old, the wiring probably faulty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to do a quick walk through. Stepping into the hallway, I immediately noticed how still everything was. The air smelled stale, thick with dust and something faintly rotten. My footsteps echoed against the cracked tile floor as I walked past the empty rooms. When I reached room 6, I hesitated. The door was shut, just like all the others, but something about it made my skin crawl. The number on the door was slightly crooked, as if someone had tried to pry it off. I reached for the handle, testing the lock. It didn't budge. Still locked. I exhaled, relieved, and turned to head back. A soft creak stopped me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. The door to room 6 was now slightly open. Just a few inches, but enough to make my stomach drop. I knew for a fact it had been shut just seconds ago. Cold air seeped out from the dark space beyond the door, carrying a faint, rancid smell. I reached for my flashlight and shined it inside. The room was empty. Just an old bed frame, a nightstand, and peeling wallpaper. But something felt off. The air was heavier, pressing against me like a weight on my chest. I took a step inside, my boots crunching against something on the floor. Looking down, I saw old, faded papers scattered across the carpet. Some were torn, others crumpled, as if someone had been through them in a hurry. I picked one up, squinting at the faded handwriting. He keeps knocking. I keep telling him to go away. But he won't. He never does. A loud bang made me jump. The door had slammed shut behind me. I ran to it, grabbing the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. My breathing grew ragged as I pounded against the wood. Then a sound came from the other side. Knocking. Slow, deliberate knocks, like someone tapping their knuckles against the wood. I stumbled back, my chest tightening. The knocking continued, steady, unhurried. Then, a voice. Low, hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Let me in." I pressed myself against the far wall, my hands shaking. The voice came again, closer this time. "I know you're in there." The knocking turned into pounding, harder, more desperate. The entire door rattled on its hinges. Then, suddenly silence. I stood there, heart hammering, waiting for anything to happen. After what felt like an eternity, I reached for the door handle again. It turned easily. The door swung open, revealing an empty hallway. The air felt different, lighter, as if whatever had been there was now gone. I didn't hesitate. I ran back to the office, locked the door behind me, and grabbed my things. I wasn't staying until morning. As I reached for my car keys, my eyes flicked to the security monitor. The hallway outside room 6 was empty, but the door was open again. And inside, just barely visible in the grainy footage, was a figure standing in the darkness, watching. I left without looking back. The next day, I called my friend and told him I was done. He didn't sound surprised. "I figured you wouldn't last," he said quietly. When I asked what was wrong with the place, he hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Room 6. There was a man who lived there years ago. He was strange, kept to himself, never checked out. One night the cleaning staff found his door open, but the room was empty. He was just gone. No bags, no wallet, nothing. Just vanished." I swallowed hard, gripping my phone tighter. "So what's knocking on the door?" I asked. There was a long pause before he answered. "We don't know." I never went back to the Redwood Inn. A few months later, the building was demolished, reduced to an empty lot. But sometimes when I drive past that stretch of road at night, I swear I see something in the distance. A single door, standing open where the motel used to be. And in the silence I can almost hear it. Knocking. Story 18. The house on Ridgeway Lane had been empty for years before my cousin Eric bought it. It was an old Victorian, its paint peeling, its windows streaked with grime, and its porch sagging under years of neglect. But Eric got it cheap, eager to restore it and turn it into a bed and breakfast. When he asked if I wanted to help, I agreed, thinking it would be just another renovation project. The first time I stepped inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of dust and something faintly rotten. The wooden floors creaked beneath my boots, the sound echoing through the hollow space. Sunlight filtered through the filthy windows, casting strange shadows along the peeling wallpaper. The house had an unsettling stillness to it, like it was holding its breath. Eric didn't seem to notice. He was excited, pointing out the high ceilings, the intricate woodwork, and the grand staircase leading to the second floor. "This place has character," he said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. I nodded, but something about the house made my stomach twist. We spent the first few days clearing out debris. Most of the furniture had been left behind, covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, we found an old trunk, its leather cracked with age. Inside were faded photographs, yellowed letters, and a child's doll with missing eyes. I picked it up, feeling the rough fabric against my palm. A strange unease settled over me. That night, Eric decided to stay in the house. "No point in driving back and forth," he said. "Besides, it'll be good to get a feel for the place." I thought he was crazy, but he was stubborn. I went home, promising to return in the morning. At around 2 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Eric. When I answered, all I could hear was static, followed by the faint sound of breathing. "Hello," I said, but there was no response. Then, just before the call ended, I heard a whisper. It was too quiet to make out the words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I drove back to the house immediately. When I arrived, the lights were off, but Eric's truck was still in the driveway. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was even heavier than before, thick with an unnatural silence. "Eric," I called, but only my voice echoed back. I found him sitting in the living room, his face pale, his hands gripping the arms of an old wooden chair. His eyes flicked to me, wide and unfocused. "I heard something," he whispered. "Footsteps upstairs." He swallowed hard. "But no one's here." I told him to grab his things and leave. We spent the rest of the night at my place, neither of us getting much sleep. The next morning he insisted on going back. "It was just my imagination," he said, forcing a smile. "The house is old, creaky, that's all." But I wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, strange things kept happening. Tools went missing and turned up in different rooms. Doors that we left open were closed when we returned. The air in the house always felt charged, like the static before a storm. And then there was the whispering. It happened to both of us. We would be working in different parts of the house and hear voices, low, indistinct murmurs. They always came from just out of sight, from empty rooms or behind closed doors. Each time we checked, we found nothing. One evening, Eric went to the basement to check the wiring while I stayed upstairs, scrubbing years of grime off the kitchen counters. I heard him call my name from the basement stairs. "Hey, come look at this." His voice was distant, almost muffled. I sighed and set down my rag, heading toward the stairs. "What is it?" No answer. I stepped onto the first stair, peering down into the darkness. "Eric." Still nothing. Then, behind me, I heard a door creak open. I spun around, my heart hammering. The hallway leading to the front door was empty, but one of the bedroom doors had swung open. I knew for a fact that I had shut it earlier. A moment later, the basement door slammed shut. Eric came running up, his face pale. "Did you just..." He stopped when he saw the open bedroom door. We stood there in silence, listening. The house was quiet now, but the air felt suffocating. Without another word, we grabbed our things and left. That night, Eric finally admitted that something was wrong. "I don't know what it is, but it doesn't want us there." He ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "I feel like I'm being watched all the time." I agreed. But Eric had already sunk too much money into the house to walk away. He refused to sell, determined to finish the renovation. I wasn't so sure. A few nights later, he called me again. "I need you to come over." His voice was tight, edged with fear. "Something's in the house." I didn't ask questions. I just drove. When I got there, he was standing on the front porch, his hands shaking. He told me he'd been upstairs when he heard footsteps in the hallway. When he turned, he saw a shadow move across the doorway. Thinking it was me, he called out, but then he heard whispering. It came from the closet. He opened the door, expecting to find nothing. But there in the darkness was the doll we had found in the trunk. He was sure we had left it downstairs, but now it was sitting in the closet, facing the doorway. "That's when I called you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We decided then and there that he needed to sell the house. No renovation, no bed and breakfast. It wasn't worth it. He put it on the market, but it sat unsold for months. People came to look, but no one made an offer. Then one day Eric called me again. Someone finally bought it. His voice sounded off, like he didn't believe it himself. A man had come by, cash in hand, offering to take it as is. No inspections, no questions. Just a quick sale. Eric accepted immediately. The day the house changed owners, Eric and I went back one last time to grab the last of his things. As we stood outside, watching the new owner unlock the front door, Eric turned to me. "You ever wonder why it was so cheap?" I thought about the whispers, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. "Yeah," I said. "I do." Eric nodded, but neither of us said anything else. We got in our trucks and left. A few months later, I drove by the house. It was still there, still crumbling, still waiting. No renovations, no signs of life. The new owner had never moved in. The house remained empty. Maybe it always would. Story 19. I moved into the house on a quiet street in Pennsylvania, drawn by its historic charm and affordable price. The realtor had been hesitant when I asked why it had been on the market for so long, but I didn't press. I needed a fresh start, and an old house with character seemed perfect. The first few days were uneventful as I unpacked and settled in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the house felt off. At first it was small things. Doors I swore I had closed would be slightly open when I walked by. My keys would disappear from the kitchen counter and turn up in strange places, like inside a cupboard or on the stairs. I blamed my own forgetfulness, though I had never been the type to misplace things. Then, there was the noise. At night I would hear faint creaking from the floor above me, as if someone was walking around. I told myself it was an old house settling, but Max, my dog, reacted differently. He would stand at the bottom of the stairs, staring up with his ears perked. Some nights, he growled low in his throat, backing away as if something was up there. One evening I decided to check. I walked up slowly, my heart pounding, but the rooms were empty. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then I found the door. It was in the hallway upstairs, partially hidden behind an old bookcase. The edges of the frame were uneven, as if it had been hastily sealed and then reopened. When I pulled it open, a narrow staircase led up to a small, windowless room. The air was thick with dust, and a single wooden chair sat in the center. I shivered but told myself it was just a storage space. Still, something about that room unsettled me. That night I woke to the sound of soft tapping. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from inside the wall. My body tensed as I listened, my breath shallow. It stopped suddenly, only for a different noise to start, the creak of a floorboard just outside my door. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone. When I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the hallway, it was empty. The next morning I searched the house, looking for anything that might explain the noises. I found something I hadn't noticed before: scratches along the base of the hidden door, as if someone had clawed at it from the inside. The sight sent a chill down my spine. Had someone been trapped in that room? The thought made my stomach turn. I called the previous owner, an older man who had lived in the house for decades before selling it. He was reluctant to talk, but after some pressing, he sighed. "I don't know what's in that house," he admitted. "But my wife, she used to hear things. She swore something was up there, something that wanted to get out." That night I locked my bedroom door. I placed a chair under the doorknob just in case. At exactly 3 a.m. I woke up. The tapping was louder now, coming from the wall directly behind my bed. Then, the doorknob rattled. The chair scraped slightly across the floor as if something was trying to force its way in. My heart pounded as I gripped my phone, barely breathing. The rattling stopped, but then I heard something worse, a whisper, low and desperate, just on the other side of the door. "Let me out," it said. My blood ran cold. I sat frozen, staring at the door, my body refusing to move. Minutes passed before I found the courage to check the hallway. I swung the door open, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, except the hidden door was open. The attic stairs led up into darkness, the chair in the small room now overturned. I left the house that morning. I packed a bag and went to stay at a motel, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I considered calling the police, but what could I tell them? That something unseen had whispered to me in the night. That a door I had closed kept opening on its own. Determined to find answers, I went to the local archives the next day. I searched for records of the house, hoping to find something, anything that would explain what was happening. After hours of digging, I found an old newspaper article from the 1940s. The house had once belonged to a man named Edward Grayson, a reclusive figure rumored to have kept his son locked in a hidden room upstairs. Neighbors reported hearing the child crying at night, begging to be let out, but no one intervened. Eventually, both father and son vanished. No bodies were ever found. My stomach twisted as I read the last lines. I thought about the scratches on the door, the whispers in the night. The desperate plea, "Let me out." I realized then that whatever had been locked in that room had never truly left. That night, I returned to the house one last time. I had already decided I would never sleep there again, but I needed to see something for myself. I walked upstairs, my hands trembling, and approached the hidden door. I hesitated before pulling it open. The attic room was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The chair had been righted, placed neatly in the center of the room again. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to leave. Then I heard it. A soft, childlike voice coming from the darkness above. "Why did you come back?" I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, my chest heaving. I left the lights on, the door open, and never looked back. I sold the house within weeks, taking a loss just to be rid of it. I never told the new owners what I experienced. Maybe they'll hear the whispers too. Maybe they'll wake up to find the attic door open. All I know is I wasn't the first to hear it, and I won't be the last. Story 20. The old Victorian house had been abandoned for years before I decided to move in. It was cheap, almost too cheap, but I was desperate for a place to stay. The real estate agent avoided my questions about its history, brushing them off with nervous laughter. I didn't care much, I just needed a fresh start. The first few nights were quiet, but something felt off. The air inside was always stale, no matter how many windows I opened. The wooden floors creaked in patterns, almost like footsteps, though I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. Then, one night, I heard something unmistakable, someone breathing just outside my bedroom door. I froze in bed, barely daring to move. The sound was low, steady, almost deliberate, as if someone was standing just inches from the door. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The air felt colder, heavier, and for the first time I questioned whether I had made a mistake moving in. Determined not to let my imagination get the best of me, I installed cameras inside the house. I placed one in the living room, one in the hallway, and another near the front door. I hoped they would put my mind at ease, proving that the noises were nothing more than an old house creaking. But when I checked the footage the next morning, my stomach dropped. The camera facing the hallway had captured something unsettling. Just past midnight, my bedroom door had opened slightly, though I knew for a fact I had locked it. A shadow moved in the dim light, shifting as if peeking into my room. Then, after a few minutes, the door slowly closed again. I tried to come up with a rational explanation, but none of them made sense. There was no sign of forced entry, no one else had a key, and all the windows were locked. The thought of someone or something lurking inside my home while I slept made my skin crawl. I barely got any sleep that night, listening for the faintest sound of movement. The next day, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed. I also installed additional bolts on the doors and made sure every window had secure latches. For a while I felt safer, convincing myself that whatever had happened was just a fluke. But then, the whispers started. It began as soft murmurs, almost like a conversation happening just out of earshot. Sometimes it sounded like a man's voice, low and gravelly, other times a woman's, barely above a whisper. No matter where I searched, I couldn't find the source. The worst part was that the whispers always seemed to come from inside the house. I started avoiding certain rooms, especially the hallway at night. I kept every light on, but that didn't stop the feeling of being watched. One evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught something in the mirror. Behind me in the dimly lit hallway, a figure stood just outside my bedroom door. I spun around so fast I nearly fell, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded as I backed into the bathroom, gripping the sink for support. I forced myself to check the hallway, but it was empty. Still, the feeling of dread lingered, stronger than ever. I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and booked a hotel for the night, needing to get out even if just for a little while. Before I left, I checked the cameras one last time, dreading what I might find. What I saw made my blood run cold. The footage showed my bedroom door opening again, but this time something stepped into the hallway. It was a man, or at least it looked like one tall, thin and unnaturally still. His face was obscured in shadow, but his head tilted slightly, as if listening. After a moment, he stepped back into the room, and the door closed behind him. I didn't go back to the house alone. The next morning, I called the police, though I wasn't sure how to explain what I had seen. They checked every room, every closet, every crawl space, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. I told them about the cameras, but when I pulled up the footage, the file was missing. It was as if it had never been recorded. The officers gave me a sympathetic look, suggesting that maybe the stress of moving had gotten to me. I didn't argue, I just wanted to leave. I moved out that same day, breaking the lease without caring about the consequences. The landlord barely seemed surprised when I told him I was leaving. He didn't ask why, didn't try to convince me to stay. Instead, he just nodded and muttered, "You're not the first." To this day, I don't know who or what was in that house. I don't know if it was something supernatural, or if someone had been living there without me knowing. But every now and then, I check the real estate listings, and that house always seems to be up for rent again. Cheap, almost too cheap. Story 21. I used to work as a night security guard at an old hotel that had been around since the early 1900s. The building had gone through several renovations, but much of the original structure remained intact. My job was simple: monitor the cameras, patrol the halls, and make sure no one wandered where they shouldn't be. At first, the job seemed easy, but over time I began to notice things that made me uneasy. There was one particular hallway on the third floor that always felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, as if I had stepped into a different place entirely. The lights flickered more often there, and the cameras covering that section sometimes cut out for minutes at a time. Guests who stayed in the nearby rooms would often request to change rooms or complain about strange noises at night. One evening I was doing my usual rounds when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps ahead of me. I turned the corner, expecting to find a lost guest, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps didn't stop, they continued ahead, always just out of sight. I walked faster, trying to catch whoever was there, but the sound remained just beyond my reach. I checked the cameras back at the security office, rewinding the footage from the past 10 minutes. There was nothing, just an empty hallway, despite the clear sound of footsteps I had heard with my own ears. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A few weeks later, I was assigned to check one of the maintenance rooms in the dormitory. The space had been out of use for years, but one of the motion sensors had picked up movement. I took my flashlight and walked down the narrow staircase, the air becoming colder with each step. The basement had a damp smell, and the silence down there felt suffocating. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, scanning the room for anything unusual. There was nothing, just old shelves and rusted equipment. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft creak behind me, like the sound of someone shifting their weight. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner. I stepped back, my pulse racing, but when I shone my flashlight directly at the spot, there was nothing there. The room was as empty as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. I locked the door behind me and hurried back upstairs, trying to suppress the rising sense of dread. Over time, I started hearing more stories from other staff members. One of the housekeepers told me about a guest who had checked out in a hurry, claiming she had woken up to the sound of someone whispering right next to her ear. Another employee mentioned that the elevator sometimes stopped on the third floor without anyone pressing the button. These weren't just isolated incidents, something about the hotel wasn't right. One night, I was sitting in the security office when an alarm went off for one of the emergency exits on the third floor. The camera showed the door standing wide open, even though no one was visible in the footage. I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. The door was still open when I arrived, but the hallway was silent. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight into the stairwell beyond the door. Just as I reached out to pull the door shut, I heard something, a low, deliberate exhale, like someone standing just inches behind me. I turned around instantly, my heart hammering in my chest, but the hallway was empty. The air felt thick, unmoving, like something was lingering just out of sight. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking as I stepped back. I checked the security footage again when I returned to the office, rewinding to the moment when the door had opened. The footage showed the door slowly swinging open on its own, with no one in sight. That was the moment I realized whatever was happening here wasn't something I could explain. As the weeks passed, I found myself growing more and more uneasy. I started dreading my shifts, especially the late hours when the hotel was at its quietest. I kept my rounds short, avoiding the third floor whenever possible. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the strange occurrences never stopped. One of my final nights on the job, I was walking past one of the empty banquet rooms when I caught movement from the corner of my eye. I turned my head, expecting to see a shadow or maybe just a reflection in the glass. Instead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a chair in the center of the room, slowly turning, as if someone had just stood up from it. I froze, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. The chair creaked softly, completing its slow rotation until it faced directly toward me. The room was empty. There was no wind, no draft, nothing that could have explained what I had just seen. I backed away, refusing to turn my back on the room until I was well down the hall. That night, I submitted my resignation. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with the feeling that something was always watching. The hotel had a history, but whatever was in that building was still there, still lingering in the empty hallways and silent rooms. I never looked back after leaving, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of footsteps just out of sight. Story 22. I used to work as a night security guard at an old hotel that had been standing for over a century. The building had been renovated several times, but some parts remained unchanged, including the basement and several storage rooms. My job was to patrol the halls, check security cameras, and ensure that everything remained in order throughout the night. The hotel had a reputation for being haunted, but I never believed in ghosts, at least not at first. One night, I was making my usual rounds when I heard the sound of a door closing somewhere on the third floor. The hotel was nearly empty, with only a few guests checked in, and none of them were staying on that floor. I walked toward the source of the sound, flashlight in hand, my boots echoing against the polished wood floor. When I reached the end of the hall, I saw that one of the room doors was slightly ajar. I checked my list and saw that the room had been unoccupied for weeks. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, shining my flashlight around the space. The bed was neatly made, the curtains were still drawn, and there were no signs of anyone having entered. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. The closet door was slightly open, and I was certain it had been closed when I first walked in. I took a step closer and hesitated before pulling the door fully open. Inside, the closet was empty except for a single wooden hanger swaying slightly as if someone had just touched it. My skin crawled as I stood there, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. There was no draft in the room, and no way someone could have slipped past me. I backed away, leaving the door open as I exited and locked the room behind me. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something had been watching me. When I checked the security footage later that night, my stomach dropped. At the exact time I had entered the room, the hallway camera showed the door slowly creaking open on its own. There was no one in sight, no movement in the hall before or after. I told myself it was a trick of the old building settling, but deep down I wasn't so sure. A few nights later, I was assigned to check the basement, a place I always hated going. It was damp, poorly lit, and filled with unused furniture and equipment. As I walked through the storage area, I noticed something out of place: a single wooden chair standing in the middle of the room. I didn't remember it being there the last time I checked. I moved closer, shining my light over the dusty floor, and that's when I saw them. Footprints in the dust, leading from the far end of the basement directly to the chair. They were clear, distinct impressions, as if someone had just walked through. My chest tightened as I followed them back to where they started, only to find the trail ended abruptly against a solid brick wall. A sudden creaking sound echoed through the basement, and I spun around, my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. The chair had moved. It was no longer in the center of the room, but was now positioned near one of the support beams. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away, refusing to turn my back until I reached the stairs. I locked the basement door behind me and didn't go back down for the rest of the night. After that, strange occurrences became more frequent. The elevator would arrive on floors no one had called it to, stopping and opening its doors to empty hallways. Guests reported hearing knocks on their doors in the middle of the night, only to find no one outside. On more than one occasion, I saw shadows moving at the end of the halls, only for them to vanish when I approached. One of the housekeepers, an older woman who had worked there for years, told me she refused to go to the third floor alone. She said that years ago, a long-term guest had been found dead in one of the rooms, sitting upright in a chair with his hands folded neatly in his lap. The cause of death was never determined, and ever since, strange things had been happening in that wing. I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but after what I had experienced, I wasn't so sure. My final shift at the hotel was the night I decided to quit. I was monitoring the security cameras when I saw movement in the main hallway. A man was standing near the front desk, facing away from the camera. He didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there. I radioed the front desk clerk, but he didn't respond. I left the security room and walked toward the lobby, but when I got there it was empty. The man was gone, and the desk clerk was sitting at his station, staring blankly at his computer screen. I asked if he had seen anyone come in, but he looked at me confused and said no one had been there all night. When I checked the footage again, the man was still standing there, but the timestamp showed that he had never left. That was enough for me. I turned in my keys the next morning and never looked back. I still think about that place sometimes, about the things I saw and the things I couldn't explain. People can say what they want about hauntings, but I know what I experienced. Some places hold on to their past, and some things refuse to stay buried. Story 23. I took a job as a night security guard at an old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. The building had been closed for over 2 decades, but the city planned to renovate it into a community center. My job was simple: walk the halls, check for trespassers, and report anything unusual. The first few nights were quiet, just the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. One night, as I made my rounds on the 3rd floor, I heard the faint sound of a door creaking open. I knew for a fact that all the doors were supposed to be locked, and no one else was in the building. I turned my flashlight toward the noise, but all I saw was an empty hallway lined with peeling wallpaper. My stomach